Hey everyone, Daquan from Elevated.net here. And in today's tutorial, I'm going to go through within a Microsoft 365 tenant what dynamic groups are, what the purpose of those dynamic groups are, how you can implement them for your tenant, and then at the end, I'm going to go through a scenario that small businesses might face and how you can address that issue with dynamic groups. So before we can talk about dynamic groups, let's talk about the traditional model of groups. So traditional model, or known as assigned groups, that's when you make the group, you would assign the user manually into that group itself, and then you take that group and then you apply that to the right permissions, folder structures, all those things yourself, right? So it's a very traditional model for how you can do that. Well, Microsoft actually introduced another type of membership type, is what it's referred to. It's called dynamic. And what you can do with that is that you can set it up so that depending on the parameters you set for that query or the syntax, it can add users or devices to the group automatically, either add or remove, right? So you can set it up to do add or remove or however it makes most sense for you. So what we're going to go ahead and do for this scenario here is for our scenario, we're going to make a new user that's going to be part of the human resources team, but we're not going to add them directly to the human resources. We're going to use dynamic groups to get them added. And the goal is to get that user and users moving forward that are in the human resources department automatically added to that site or to that team. So first off, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to make a brand new user just so you can test with here. So I'm going to make a brand new user. I'm going to call him like, I don't know, like I'll call him like our Barrel. Rob, yeah, his name's Rob Barrel. Don't judge him, okay? That he didn't get his name. I gave him his name. Um, and what we're gonna want to do, right? This is gonna be one of those opportunities that you're gonna definitely want to fill out more than just this here. You want to go down to properties, and what we'll do is make sure that he's in the human resources department, and we'll say he's like the HR assistant, and then Rob Barrel, just a great name. And then we'll make sure there's a manager attached as well. This is just for the organization, and this is really just for my type of setup here, following my process. And really, the big thing is making sure that the department is set for human resources or whatever field makes sense for the group you want to tie it to. I generally recommend making sure that the team site matches the department, just so it makes things easier here. And I'll show you kind of why in a minute. All right, so we went ahead and created our user. So what we're going to want to do first is we're going to set up the team site for human resources to accept dynamic queries and have those parameters. And then we'll have it so that in the end, Rob Barrel will be automatically added to that site. So under either enter or the portal.azure.com, you want to go to your groups, and you can go to the site you have created, or you can make one, of course, right? And then under the actual group itself, you go to properties, and you can actually change the membership type. So this is where you get set it up. So it's either dynamic user. In some cases, it'll show dynamic device as well. But in this case, it's going to be just a dynamic user, because I think there's a user in here, so that's why the other option's not available there for me. What we'll do is we'll set it up for a dynamic user here. So once you switch that option, now you have these options to do these like add dynamic queries. And this is the parameters I was talking about getting it so that as long as somebody is applicable to these rules, they will be added or removed to this group automatically. So the first thing I like to do is, for this case, what I want to do is that we're going to add a couple rules here. So the first rule I'm going to add is one, make sure the count is enabled, and then two, make sure they have the actual department field filled out for human resources. And as long as as long as those two rules apply, it will be automatically added to this group. So first, under configure rules here, what we'll do is we'll just choose the property to account enabled. We want the operator to equals, and then change just to true for the value. And then for the expression, add another expression here for the department. So to make sure it's like as long as it's true and the department on their account is set for human resources. And then down here below under rule syntax, you can see this is the syntax that it follows to basically make sure that the rules apply to the proper people or devices or accounts, or however you want to see that there. And so, for example, let's go ahead and we can validate this rule real quick. And that's a nice thing about dynamic groups. You can actually validate it before implementing it in your organization. So this gives you an opportunity to really mess with these before causing havoc to your business here, right? So under the validate rules here, we can simply just check a couple users. So Ariana Grande, who is our chief marketing officer, has no need to be in the human resources group, right? And her department is actually marketing. So she should straight up fail, right? So while her account is enabled, her department is set for marketing, right? However, for the user Rob Barrel we just added, he does have his account enabled and he is part of human resources. And he is applicable because he meets both these fields. Okay, so we can go ahead and click on save here. And then what we'll go ahead and do, we'll save one more time. And then it will tell you if you already made the site signed before, it will tell you it's going to change that there. So just be aware of that. So I generally recommend before making the massive changes, you kind of want to have things in place so you can make the switch and then make it pretty easy for it to automatically add, or else it'll cause havoc across your organization. So go ahead and click on yes here. And then what will happen is we already have a couple people in here, and I'll go through how we get those people in here later. But what we'll see now in a little bit here is that we're going to have Jerry Fisher, who's another HR assistant, and Rob Barrel is going to appear in here as well. Okay, and then after waiting a few minutes here, we now see that Rob Barrel, as well as Ethan Fendel, who's the Chief Human Resources Officer in this scenario here, is also added to the Human Resources group. So that's how you can do and how you can set up the dynamic groups to work for your organization. So now Rob has access to everything under human resources, the team itself, and wherever that team has permissions, he will also have permissions for. So that's a pretty easy way to get dynamic groups working. It can take about 10, 15 minutes or even longer for those dynamic groups to kick in. It could take up to 24 hours realistic. I think that's what Microsoft says, up to 24 hours or about 24 hours or so. So definitely one of those things you want to just be prepared ahead of time. Just know it's not going to be super instant, and it is there for you. Okay, well, now that we know how to set up dynamic groups here, I want to go through a common scenario small businesses are going to run across and how you can use dynamic groups to address the issue, and also some features with dynamic groups that were just introduced last year to help you address that issue. So I want to run across a scenario here for you guys. So in your organization, looking at this org chart right now, there's only 6 people. Now there's people under a couple other people, right? Marketing has a web developer. Other departments don't have anybody under them at all. But let's say in this scenario, for some reason, the chief legal officer who's in the legal department, and they already have their own legal sites, needs access to the HR folder, right? Maybe there's some legal human resources things that need to happen, and it makes sense that Lee Hennessy also has access to the human resources site. Okay. So how you can address this is that you can do what Microsoft introduced last year through nested groups. What that means is that we can make a dynamic group that allows you to basically either add or remove users depending on the groups they're already associated with. What that means is that we can make a dynamic group that would automatically add anybody with the human resources department. And then we can make exceptions for other users because a lot of organizations, especially small organizations, they don't get to have the privilege to, be siloed within their own particular site or their team. Sometimes there is a little crosstalk. Sometimes they wear multiple hats. So and I'll show you how you can address this here. So first off, we already kind of did part 1, right? Or a little bit of part 1. We're going to have to kind of redo some things here. But what'll happen is if we go back to the actual human resources group itself, you're going to need a couple of things. One, you're going to need the group IDs of the groups you want to add here. So we're going to make another group called for the dynamic users, and then a group for the exception users or assigned users. And then 2, there's another set of commands we have to add so that it checks for those groups first, and it will add it depending on the groups they're in. So what I'm going to go ahead and do first is I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to go ahead, let's make a couple of security groups here. Keep in mind, you can't nest a Microsoft team with another Microsoft team, so it has to be a security group you're going to use here. So I'm going to make one called ASG-HR-Dynamic. That'll be the HR Dynamic group. As you can see, I may have already done this tutorial before. And then we're going to switch the membership type here to dynamic user. Notice that I do have the option for dynamic device. I think I have it in this case because I don't have any users assigned to it yet to mess with that. So you have dynamic user, the owner. I think in this case, I'm more than happy to make Ethan, who's the chief of human resources, that owner. And then for the query, we'll just do what we did earlier, right? So we'll go ahead and do, okay, if you're applicable, make sure it equals your account is enabled. And then we'll make sure your department equals human resources. So while that gets created, we're going to make another group, another security group called ASG-HR-assigned. This is going to be where we can put that traditional group I mentioned earlier here. This is going to be the HR assigned group for exceptions. Assigned, leave that as is. There has to be an owner, so I'll make Ethan the owner again here. And then for member, so we're looking to have Lee, part of the legal team, be in this here. Okay. So we're going to let those groups get created here. And then what I'm going to do, as you can see, I told you I made this tutorial before, but I wanted to make it better for you guys. So we're going to need those group objects I was talking about earlier here. So to get those group objects, what you can do is that once the group is created, this is object IDs right here, we're going to need these. So I'm going to get the group ID or the object ID of the assigned group. So let's do like HR assigned. Okay. And then I will get the object ID of the dynamic group as well. We're going to have to keep these in mind here, and you'll see why in a moment. So now we're ready to set up the dynamic group on the human resources site or team to allow this to work for both groups we just set up here. So if we go back to the human resources team, we go to dynamic membership rules, there's a whole nother set of commands we're going to have to use. So we can clear this entire thing out, and I will put a link in the description for the documentation for this, but Microsoft actually has documentation for this exact scenario and how you can address this. But really the permission and rule we're going to use here is basically if the user is a member of any of the following groups, and then it's going to simply just allow those or add those in here. So I'm just copy and paste that here. And then the group IDs we gathered earlier, that's where you're going to want to put in these group ID fields. So make sure ASG HR is in here. And then we're going to make sure that the dynamic group's in here as well for HR. Click on OK. A couple things to note too is that unfortunately it's still kind of a relatively new thing they implemented last year. So if you're trying to validate the rule, it actually will error out regardless if they're applicable or not. So unfortunately, it's going to be one of those things you're just going to have to hope you're right on, or know the syntax, or be able to test it with another group for testing prior to implementing it into a production environment. So I'll go ahead and click on save here. And now the waiting game to see about getting everybody applied here. So basically based off our rules, Ethan, Jerry, and Rob, who are part of the human resources department, should be here. And then we should see Lee being added automatically to this group. And review the entry portal here, and there we go. Lee is now also added to the human resources team. And there you go. That really concludes the tutorial here for dynamic groups. I just learned this earlier today, and I just wanted to share it with everybody else. So I hope somebody learned something out there because of this here. If you like this kind of content, make sure to comment, like, and subscribe. Let me know down below if there's anything else you want me to go through or learn about or discuss, or maybe you have a different take on this. Maybe there's a different way I should have went about explaining this, or any sort of feedback I will gladly appreciate. That being said, thank you so much for watching, and have a good one.